So thank you. So it's now my job to introduce the chair of the Department of International Health, who's going to do the next introduction. And the chair is Dr. David Peters, who is a professor in international health, and he's worked in health systems as a researcher, policy advisor, educator, recovering bureaucrat, manager, and clinician in low and middle income countries for over 25 years. His research interests include the performance of health systems, the interaction of poverty in health systems, implementation of health services in low-income countries, innovations in organization, technology, and financing of health systems, the role of the private sector in health systems, and institutional capacity strengthening in low-income countries. He's a pioneer in the development of sector-wide approaches, which approach now commonly used to allocate aid in donor aid in developing countries. And he developed the first national balanced scorecard to assess health services and implemented that in Afghanistan for nearly 10 years. So, David?
Thanks, Mike. And I have the singular pleasure of introducing Dr. Klaus Kraemer. But before that, I should let you know that I also learned about the role of the dean from Pierre. You know, we have offices on the 8th floor together, and you know, in my first week in office, I was seeking some advice, and we're standing there in the hallway, and I said, I have this very sensitive problem, it's personnel problem, and I think I need help, and I need nothing less than a dean. And Pierre turns to me and says, David, there is nothing lower than a dean. So. Anyway, this is quite an elevated time actually to talk about the centennial celebration, and I'm struck by this story of a story of discovery. It's a story of drive and determination, and it's also really a story of collaboration. And it also has as a common theme this vision or goal of trying to improve nutritional health and the health of particularly of disadvantaged populations of the poor, and that's something that's remarkable. But it's also something that Dr. Klaus Kraemer embodies all of these attributes. He is a scientist, and as a scientist, he's done research on the development and identification of new micronutrient products, but he's also collaborated in field research, population research, and surveillance on disadvantaged populations around the world, and particularly in Bangladesh and Indonesia, as well as refugee camps in Kenya. He is a longtime educator, a technical advisor, and a mentor, and he continues to play important roles in this as well as in communications between scientists and practitioners, policymakers, and advocacy work. So Dr. Kraemer is currently the director of Sight and Life, a humanitarian nutrition agency of DSM that's seeking to improve the quality of diet and nutritional health of the world through education, technical assistance, and advocacy. As I learned yesterday, is the editor of the Sight and Life magazine, and I'm very pleased to say that he is a recently appointed adjunct associate professor in the Department of International Health here at the School of Public Health. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Klaus Kraemer.
Good afternoon, Dr. Peters, Dean Clark, Dr. West. I'm really thrilled about the honor of being adjunct faculty of the School of Public Health in the Department of International Health here in Baltimore. I was also not totally sure whether you were talking about me, Dr. Peters, introducing me today. And it is a difficult task now to follow the great Dr. Bruce Ames and speaking about hidden hunger around the globe. It's a broad topic Dr. West has charged me to speak about today. And I ever believed that hidden hunger, the term was coined for the Ending Hidden Hunger Conference in 1991 in Montreal in Canada. But my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Richard Sommer of the medical school, he passed on to me a book published in 1943 in the United States entitled The National Malnutrition hidden hunger is it's starving millions. That is talking about the United States, not the developing countries, where we are mainly focusing at. Hidden hunger has been poorly defined in the past. And we decided in 2009 to gather a group more casually during the International Nutrition Conference in Bangkok to start a discussion about developing a hidden hunger index. We didn't achieve that at this meeting, but we achieved in a definition of hidden hunger, and we defined it as a lack or loss of dietary quality that leaves individuals or populations with deficiencies of essential micronutrients, which negatively impact on health, cognition, survival, function, and economic potential. This was followed by another consultation about a year later, and then I will talk a bit about later in my presentation a publication, and the first entitled, I believe, advocacy paper running a peer-reviewed process on a hidden hunger index. We know that micronutrient deficiencies are widespread in the developing world, but also in the developed world, as we can follow Dr. Ames in this presentation. And the number of people with micronutrient deficiencies or hidden hunger is meant to be in the range of 2 billion. And these are primarily the big fives, like zinc, vitamin A, iodine, folate, and iron. And more recently, and I'm just back from the Doha meeting in Singapore, vitamin B12 appears to be very important during fetal development in reducing non-communicable diseases in later life. This slide, this iceberg is slightly modified from Dr. West's slide on the tip of the iceberg and the underlying reasons for severe micronutrient deficiencies. If we look at the top here, I have a pointer. We usually look at the top, which is above the surface. And it's about just in the tens of millions of people who may be affected by overt deficiency diseases like blindness, rickets, or scurvy. But underneath the water surface, we have a number of effects, systemic effects that lead to subclinical deficiency, that can impair cognition, that can impair immune function, and it can, of course, result in birth defects like neural tube defects. And that is a cause of tissue and plasma depletion with micronutrients, and the underlying causes are in low dietary quality, frequent infections and diarrhea, suboptimal breastfeeding and complementary feeding, endemic enteropathy, something very important recently described related to the gut microbiome, and I think this is an area to focus at a lot in the future, and of course environmental toxin like aflatoxin and heavy metals. And here we have the invisible part, the hidden part, which will lead to significant health consequences. Just a snapshot about dietary intakes. I'm personally not in favor using dietary intakes to signify micronutrient deficiencies. We need indicators that can measure nutrient status. But here, a recent paper from Bangladesh using intakes of different vitamins and minerals in breastfed children and lactating women, and this is the prevalence of adequacy. And here we see that just for vitamin B6, there's almost 100% of the adequacy reached, and for some nutrients, and I hardly can believe that calcium is at 0 and vitamin A is at almost 0 in this paper, but it shows that there are still significant gaps in the nutrient supply of these micronutrients. I was intrigued by a recent paper by Kay Dewey, and Kay from UC Davis. She looked into the supply of iron and zinc as an example in breast milk only, reaching a percentage of the RNI, and the red line is 100% RNI, and then breast milk plus a typical cereal and pulses-based complementary food reaching just less than 40% of the RNI for iron, and breast milk and diverse complementary food that contains animal food is still not reaching 100% of the RNI. And she compared that with a diet of the hunters and gatherers, apparently much more complete in providing iron as well as zinc. This is from a paper from Richard Sember. We published 2 years or 1 year back a special edition in the Journal of Nutrition on multiple micronutrients and evidence based on history, on epidemiology, on basic science, and on randomized controlled trials. And Richard Sember, he tried to compare the dietary diversity in different socioeconomic strata. These are the not poor. They have a number of diverse foods in the diet. And here this is for an Asian population. Rice is still the majority, but going to the bottom with the extremely poor, they eat very little of fruits, vegetables, and oil, sugar. They cannot afford animal food, which is rich in micronutrients, and we have the highest risk of deficiencies in these poor populations. Another important aspect to be considered in hidden hunger, these are high food prices. They are particularly affecting the poor, and here I have drawn from the FAO food price index the time from 1990 to 2011, and here we have extracted the time between 2004 and 2011, and here we had the two high food price spikes, and that affected significantly the nutrient status of the poor. In this crisis in 2008, more than 100 people were driven in the poverty range under $1.25 per day. And with this low amount of income, it is almost impossible, or it's impossible to buy a balanced diet, which provides rich varieties in fruits, vegetables, and animal food. Here, based on the food price crisis in Asia, in Indonesia, there was one study that shows that child underweight was not affected by the food price crisis in the years between 1997 and 2000, likely because the mothers, they were balancing the intake of food of the children and eating less food. But at the same time, when child underweight was not significantly changing, hemoglobin levels were significantly dropping down. This means that also the children received a diet that was less rich in micronutrient or iron-rich components. I don't want to go into details with this table from the recent Lancet series, and Dr. Bob Black is the lead author in this paper, and he has drawn with his colleagues for a number of micronutrients, vitamin A, iodine, zinc, and iron, the prevalence of deficiencies globally and in different regions, just highlighted Africa and Asia, which are still the regions with the highest micronutrient deficiencies. This paper was not published when we started to think about the hidden hunger index, where we wanted to integrate these indicators, vitamin A, iodine, zinc, and iron deficiency, in one index. And this is a global map that was drawn from this index. The countries with the dark orange color, they had an alarmingly high hidden hunger index going to mild, and in many areas we didn't have the data. We had to rely on global databases, national representative data from WHO, UNICEF, MIX, and DHS surveys that were incorporated into this hidden hunger index. And here we see, as anticipated, the most severe micronutrient deficiencies in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. In this slide, we have drawn the DALIs derived from iron, vitamin A, and zinc deficiency, and the data were provided by Dr. Black, who was co-author of this paper. And here we also see again that the DALIs related to micronutrient deficiencies are clustered in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. Just as an overview, Nigeria had the highest hidden hunger index and Ghana the lowest of the 10 countries that were most severely affected. Then we calculated a number of correlations, and this correlation here shows our hidden hunger index with the Human Development Index, which is a composite for long and healthy life, education, and standard of living. And here we see a strong negative correlation of the hidden hunger index with Human Development Index from the year 2007. And when we did the same correlating hidden hunger with undernourishment, and the recent data of undernourished people in the world is over 840 million people, there we see that there's a poorer correlation, and the undernourishment is just about caloric intake. It's the number of the people that can achieve 2,100 calories per day from the food that's available in a country. And what we still also see, at relatively low percentages of undernourishment, the hidden hunger index can be very high, as here in many of the African countries that are the letters in black. Just to briefly summarize, hidden under index correlates with the Human Development Index. So people with a high Human Development Index had a low hidden hunger index, and at low undernourishment, we even observe a high hidden hunger in the population. Micronutrient deficiencies were responsible for 1.5 to 12% of total DALIs in the 36 high burden countries, here with 1.5% for South Africa and 12%, for example, for Ivory Coast. But I would like to highlight a number of limitations. There is a lack of biomarkers and outdated national data we had to rely upon, and particularly representative data. We don't have data for multiple micronutrients, and we had even to use proxy indicators for zinc and for iron deficiency, and I think this is really an issue that we have to address and improve the data quality we are working upon. I was asked to talk about global micronutrient deficiencies or hidden hunger. This is the only slide, other than the book from 1943. And this publication from Fulgoni in 2011 shows here with the dark bars, that's a natural occurring amount of micronutrients, or in this case vitamins, in the diet. And specifically for folic acid, we see that here a significant amount of folic acid is provided through fortified foods. And the United States mandated flour fortification with folic acid in 1996. And since that time, neural tube defects and deficiencies in folic acid or folate have dramatically shrunken in this country. I don't want to speak about this specifically. There are more speakers to come, but we also have good news. We have evidence-based interventions that we can use to address micronutrient deficiencies, and Dr. Sommer will certainly talk about vitamin A supplementation, and Dr. Black, I expect, will talk about some others of these 10 evidence-based nutrition-specific interventions that were published recently in The Lancet. Just to come to an end, to conclude, single micronutrient deficiencies still persist in large parts of the developing world. We can also demonstrate that there are multiple micronutrient deficiencies that always coexist. Usually if there's an iron deficiency, like there's also a vitamin B12 deficiency or zinc deficiency or vitamin A deficiency in the population. But the true magnitude of micronutrient deficiencies remains hidden with outdated, fragmented, and incomplete data. And deficiencies are likely to have causes in their context, in the context people live. And we need to better understand the context in order to effectively eradicate micronutrient deficiencies. Otherwise, we won't be successful. And of course, we want to move more and more into programs and scaling up of programs, but we need to continue to build the evidence in science and in programs. And I would like to plead that scientists and program people would really work more closely together in order to improve the program quality. I'd also like to conclude, we know that poverty alleviation is important in reducing also micronutrient deficiency and improving nutrition and economic growth in countries, but just rising incomes is not sufficient. We have to address micronutrient deficiencies now. We have a number of evidence-based, evidence-proven interventions that are available, that are on hand, and they need to be taken to scale. And I would also particularly plead that breastfeeding is extremely important, that we have to encourage women to breastfeed exclusively and then to introduce the adequate complementary food after 6 months. And we have to address micronutrient deficiencies through supplementation, through mandatory and voluntary fortification of stable food, and of course of using biofortification as new tools to address micronutrient deficiencies. Thank you.
We have time for probably 1 or 2 short questions. 3 minutes.
You might have this coming. It seems to me, in my great ignorance in this field, that there are deficiencies in just about everything, and that a lot of the programs try the effect of A, the effect of E, the effect of C. Why not give them the Cori bar that is going to supplement everything and cause no damage for somebody who might have enough of this or that? I'm just puzzled.
I cannot more than agree. Giving a low-dose multiple micronutrient supplement would really do the job. And we know in pregnant women, in the meantime, that iron and folic acid is not as good as a multiple micronutrient, and I think this is the way to go, moving towards multiple micronutrients.
We've learned about the deficiencies of micronutrients that are like well known, vitamin A, zinc, iron. Are there information about trace minerals, selenium, tin, vanadium, those trace minerals?
There is knowledge about trace minerals, particularly selenium, which follows usually the deficiency also of iodine. And Finland started many years ago to add selenium to the fertilizer so that selenium could be provided through the whole food chain.
Thank you, Dr. Kraemer. We've had 2 speakers that have given us a breadth of the issues that are challenging us in understanding this aspect of nutrition. Our next speaker needs really no introduction, but it is really a pleasure to do this. We have a birthday vitamin, of course, that's kicking this off, and vitamin A was named A for that reason. But we have a special speaker to address this vitamin, Dean Emeritus Alfred Sommer, Professor Alfred Sommer, an ophthalmologist. He declares he knows little about nutrition, but in fact, he knows a great deal about nutrition. Dr. Ames, he's an example of where nutrition and epidemiology meet. We have several people on the program today, so we hope to convince you that nutrition and epidemiology actually fit together very well when we have the facts on both sides. Dean Sommer, Dean Emeritus Sommer,
Thank you.
a long-term mentor. Would you like to speak? Or should I just keep on going?
Sit down. He's going to tee me up. I am not going to tell any Dean jokes, Clegg, so don't worry about it.
You're the only one.
Yes. Well, they reverberate back on you. Okay, here we go. So we're going to do a fast review of, this is forward, I presume, right? Great. Right. Of vitamin A. So we can entitle this talk Grr, 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 just to keep you awake, or Grr, Grr, Grr. So what does all that stand for? It means got it right, got it wrong, got it right, finally, or again. So got it right. So who got it right? The early nutritionists got it right. Discovery of vitamins, which we're celebrating at this symposium, Hopkins, accessory factors, vital amines, Osborne and Mendel's butterfat, and of course McCullum and Davies fat-soluble A. They knew what they were talking about. E.V. McCullum, I'm showing that for you, Pierre, since you didn't show his picture. Of course, it's right outside this hall. People can go and play basins during the break. So famous E.V. McCullum, and even a more famous rat that the dean wouldn't allow him to use, but he used anyway, the hooded rat, which became the experimental model for nutrition back in the turn of the last century. And of course, this was the famous paper by McCullum and Davies about the importance of certain lipins in the diet during growth. And they all got it right. They recognized that vitamin A deficiency led to reduced growth, reduced resistance to infection, increased mortality, and only near the end of that did the ophthalmologist get involved with the disease of the eye called xerophthalmia. And this is a curve drawn by Stevenson, clocking the deaths of deficient rat pups, and what this is showing here is that they are dying off long before they're dying off with the eye disease, xerophthalmia. And this is Professor Bloch, a famous pediatrician in Denmark, who did a series of landmark observations in humans about the relationship between something that was missing from their diet, presumably vitamin A, and then a series of consequences. And following one of his earlier papers about xerophthalmia, E.V. McCullum, again, now here, 1917, we feel confident that these cases of xerophthalmia reported by Mori, who is Japanese and reporting a similar syndrome from Japan, and Bloch should be looked upon as a deficiency disease not hitherto recognized in its true relationship to diet. And Bloch, in 1924, after a series of observations, vitamin A deficiency is ushered in by failure to gain weight, an increased susceptibility, and a diminished power of resistance to infection. The eye lesion does not appear, as a rule, until late in the disease. Green and Mellenby, of course, went on, following again a series of observations by others, and called vitamin A the anti-infective vitamin. So essentially, by the 1930s, those brilliant nutritionists had the entire story worked out. And then they got it all wrong. And what happened was that they generalized at a period when it was difficult to generalize. So Ellison did this beautiful paper, which I'll mention later, on measles, showing you could treat acute severe measles in children in London who are hospitalized with severe measles in 1930 and reduce their case fatality rates in half. Well, people then said, well, wow, this is anti-infective. Let's give it to anybody who has an infection. And that's where they went wrong. So they tried it on puerperal sepsis, they tried it on influenza, they tried it on colds, and of course it didn't work. And it didn't work, or they got inconsistent results, because the disease was not one amenable. The context, the population in Europe was not particularly vitamin A deficient anymore. The methodologies were poor. They were using it as an acute treatment for an acute disease as opposed to a prophylaxis by improving the vitamin A status so they could fend off the disease. and their interest was overtaken by the sudden advent of antimicrobial agents. And as I said, the nutrition of Europe started to improve. So if you just compare, if one was going to do a randomized trial between penicillin and vitamin A, which nobody's ever done as far as I know, I mean, here's a treatment, this is a prevention, so you have to do it more or less ahead of time. Here you get an immediate impact, here it's usually delayed. This will impact what was then most of the infectious agents, the bacterial infectious agents at the times. This only some conditions, 90% effective. This was 70% failure because it was the wrong diseases, and that was only when it worked at all. So the world of nutrition and pediatrics, basically from the 1930s onward, completely forgot about the importance of vitamin A in its many roles other than for xerophthalmia. So along comes this ophthalmologist who knows absolutely nothing about nutrition other than as it affects the eye, and I go off to study vitamin A deficiency as a cause of xerophthalmia and stumble onto some things that I hadn't anticipated. And we started to get it right again, but not without some resistance. So many of you have seen this slide before. This was basically following children in 6 villages in Indonesia, some of whom would develop night blindness, some beetle spots, some both together, and some whose eyes look normal. At the beginning of a 3-month observational period, we re-examined them every 3 months for 18 months, and much to our surprise, and we hadn't been looking for this, was that the children who had night blindness at the beginning of a 3-month observational period died at 3 times the rate as the children who had normal-looking eyes. And these children were not normal vitamin A status. It was just that their eyes didn't have xerophthalmia. They were like those pups that died early, as it turns out, but without eye disease. And children with a little bit more vitamin A deficiency correlated with not only their clinical condition, they had beetle spots, but also with their serum vitamin A levels, died at 6 times the rate, and those with both conditions together, a purer group died at almost 9 times the rate. So from this data, when we published this, which nobody paid any attention to because it was so absurd to think that vitamin A status could impact on mortality, by the very profession that had made the story completely validated 40, 50 years earlier, I had calculated, it must all have to do with the severity of xerophthalmia. I mean, you have to have that severe vitamin A deficiency to have increased mortality. And in that original paper, I extrapolated the death rates and said, if we could rid the world of xerophthalmia in children who are vitamin A deficient and have it, we could reduce child mortality by roughly 15%, because I thought all the mortality was associated with vitamin A deficiency severe enough to cause xerophthalmia. Well, we then went ahead and did the first randomized trial, and we reduced mortality 35%, not 15%. And that was the first clue, I think, we had to then rediscovering the older literature, that in fact, where did those other half of the kids who didn't die come from? They were the kids who were vitamin A deficient, but not sufficiently deficient to develop xerophthalmia. So half the deaths that were being prevented were kids who were getting xerophthalmia, half the deaths who were being prevented were kids who were vitamin A deficient, but much more mildly so they didn't develop xerophthalmia, but they were already at increased risk of severe infections and mortality. And then, as you know, lots of trials were done around the world, and except for 2 very poorly done studies, which we won't get into, the overall reduction rate was about 35% wherever you did it. Indonesia, India, Nepal, or Africa, which actually surprised me that it was so uniform. And this is just the Asian trials, which came up with an overall effect of 34% reduction in mortality, which is pretty much the same thing we got in that first original study. Now, the vitamin A status is, of course, impacting on other diseases, essentially infectious diseases that are going to kill children because they can't fend off those. They have suppressed immune responses, and they're more likely to die. This was 3 of those prevention trials where children were either given vitamin A prophylactically or given placebos, and the children who were in the villages that were assigned to vitamin A If you look at their measles mortality rate, so they got vitamin A, and some time over the next 4 to 6 months they got measles, they're only half as likely to have died if they had been in the vitamin A group. So that was prophylactic and prevention. And interestingly, we then ended up doing some trials of treatment of children who had severe measles in hospital, randomizing them to get large doses of vitamin A in the first 2 days or not, and you got exactly the same 50% reduction. And then we went back and found that original paper was done in 30 but published in 1932 in England. So we had 3 studies in which you got a 50% reduction in case fatality rates treating kids with severe measles. You got a 50% reduction in measles mortality if you just improve the vitamin A status of children before they got measles. So that's about as good as it usually gets for epidemiologic research in the field. So right after those trials, WHO UNICEF came out with a joint recommendation that vitamin A should be used for the treatment of measles anywhere in the world. The American Academy of Pediatrics followed suit here in the U.S., particularly for populations in the U.S. who might be consuming traditional diets from where they come. Still, countries wanted more data. Still, a lot of scientists didn't believe it, and we finally decided we had done enough trials, enough other people had done enough trials. We had to call a halt to this whole thing. We organized a meeting at the Bellagio Center for the Rockefeller Foundation, which is a nice place. You know, the good food, good wine, beautiful scenery, hard to argue. At least that was the theory. And we got 22 people there who had been doing studies, who were experts in child survival and nutrition. And after looking at all the data for 4 days, came out with only 3, that's all we asked for, was 3 conclusions: that improving the vitamin A status of children and populations that are vitamin A deficient, it will reduce all-cause mortality by 1/3. It specifically reduces measles and diarrhea mortality, and prompt treatment cuts measles case fatality rates in half. And I asked everybody to go off and publish these findings and these conclusions in their favorite medical journal. So I published it in The Lancet, someone else published it in the Medical Journal of South Africa, and so forth. So the whole message sort of swept the medical world at once, that for the most part, there was scientific consensus around this. So where do we stand today? These are some nice projections that Keith largely was responsible for. Vitamin A deficiency disorder, that means any metabolic disturbance from deficiency probably affects 150 to 200 million children every year. Xerophthalmia of some degree affects about 3 million children and 3 million pregnant women every year. About 500,000 children would go blind every year, and there are about 1 to 2 million preventable deaths every year if we did not have vitamin A intervention programs. Fortunately, by now we do have vitamin A intervention programs around the world. One of the things is once you have a message, you have to get the message out. This was a visit of Hugh Downs and the TV program 2020 that came to see the work and film it in the Philippines. Hugh Downs was just enamored with this work. He showed it 3 times, once on a regular program, once on the 20th anniversary of 2020, which I didn't watch, but my son watched. So they were doing clips over the first 20 years, and my son told me the next day, "You were right up there with Vietnam, Dad." So I'm not sure I wanted to be right up there with Vietnam, but anyway. And then his last program, he again showed the vitamin A story. My Christmas present in 1997, this was a lead editorial in New York Times, malnutrition's 20-cent treatment. Scott Shane wasn't working for the Times at that point, I don't think, so I don't know who was responsible for this. They never talked to me. They don't talk to anybody that I know about, and I don't know where they got 20 cents from, but nonetheless, it was a nice editorial. One of the issues, and Dr. Ames talked about mechanisms being important. So this is not a molecular mechanism. This was the thing that bothered me, was why was it so common for children anywhere in the developing world to be vitamin A deficient? We had something wrong. I mean, they were, no matter where you looked, they were deficient. And the reason turned out, when people looked at it, a colleague of mine, Muhilal in Indonesia is the first that I think of, but then some of our Dutch colleagues, that in fact, the traditional, and I think it's still the FAO and WHO conversion rate, is to take 6 molecules of beta-carotene in diet to make 1 molecule of vitamin A. And that is patently wrong. And The IOM, always being a conservative group, decided it really took more. They went to 12, so that makes only half as much vitamin A in at least the vegetable food supply. But in fact, if you look at the real data coming from the developing world, fruit and squash, which don't have quite as much fibers, you need about 12 molecules of beta-carotene to make one of vitamin A. Green leafy vegetables, they're green, they're colored, right? So they're color-coded. They take 26 molecules of beta-carotene to make one of. So what is the practical implications of that? Well, this is what we should have figured out a long time ago. So the orange bars are how much vitamin A there is in the food supply using the 6-to-1 ratio. So there's plenty everywhere, basically. If everybody gets their fair share, nobody gets their fair share. Some get too much, that means some get too little, but basically there's enough for everybody. If you use the IOM's 12-to-1 ratio, well, now Africa's a little short, South America's a little short, Asia's about 30 to 40% short. And if you use the real data, which is 21-to-1 by Clive West's calculations, well, now Africa is down about 45%, South America's down about 40%, and Asia only has about 40% of the vitamin A supply that they need. So that's why children are vitamin A deficient everywhere in the world, because there is not enough vitamin A in the food supply if they got their fair share in order to get as much as they need. So this is the reconfiguration, but really it's reconfiguring what everybody knew in the 1920s and 30s, and that is as you get vitamin A deficient, the first manifestations are systemic. There's a reduction in immune competence, increase in infections, increase in mortality, anemia, decreased growth, and then only later with more severe deficiency do you actually get the ocular complications, which is what got me into the game to begin with. And of course, there has been a long time UNICEF-sponsored program. They estimate that there are 70 countries in the world that have vitamin A supplementation programs. 50 of them claim to reach 80% of the children twice a year. I suspect that's not true. I suspect that's an overestimate. But nonetheless, people are trying to do it. We have persistent risks. Not only are we not reaching all the children who need it, but the persistent risk is not using every alternative strategy like diets, supplements, biofortification, anesthesia from success. You know, every government has said, oh, we've controlled that problem, let's move on to another one. So you have the risk of things are going well, let's forget it. And why to forget it? Well, let's abandon it because there's a new disease du jour that has just been identified by WHO or UNICEF as being the hottest new disease that we really have to tackle. So where are you going to get the money from? You take it away from ongoing programs that are highly successful, and of course everything that implodes. This is just to remind you, there are these other interventions. This is Petrikis, who came up with the golden rice thing. It's a long way from actually having any utility, but if it does, and if you're in a rice-eating country and people eat yellow-looking rice, it could, in fact, make a big difference. Lessons for the future: discovery and programmatic intervention of other micronutrients, like many of the ones that were discussed by Dr. Ames and Klaus. You got to follow up unexpected findings. You have to reproduce the results in different populations if you want different populations and countries to think that they're important and willing to take some of their resources and put them into programs. You have to bring other researchers along and reach a scientific consensus. You have to work that scientific consensus, and of course you have to engage policymakers. Be sure you understand the evidence, keep moving forward, and bury the opposition in data. Now, that doesn't necessarily get rid of all the opposition. So this is Professor Michael Latham of recent memory, a very senior nutritionist at Cornell, who only a few years ago, very soon before he died, and it was, I think, not causally related to that, published a single article in this journal, digital journal, and it was a 12-page diatribe about why I was entirely wrong and why Keith and the rest of us who have been working on vitamin A called the Great Vitamin A Fiasco. So you can't always convince everybody. You just have to convince people who have brains. We also have to acknowledge the fact that we were supremely lucky in our choice of micronutrient to study. Vitamin A deficiency was ubiquitous among children in the developing world. That's not true of almost anything else. It impacts commonly deadly infections, so we were able to identify there was something else going on, in this case, largely measles and diarrhea. And you had a practical intervention. That is, a large capsule given only twice a year, so it's like an immunization. There are very few other micronutrients that meet all of those criteria. I hate to show economic analyses because, all economists are two-handed. One of our former presidents here said, "Give me a one-handed economist," and so don't pay any great attention to the actual number. It's just to give you an order of magnitude, which I found fascinating. So this was the number of dollars that had to be spent in programs to prevent one death. So vitamin A came in at $23, bed nets at $200, and ORT, oral rehydration, at almost $4,000. And the reason there, of course, is because lots of kids are getting diarrhea all the time, only some of which are going to kill you, but if you keep using ORT all the time, it's going to be fairly costly. The Copenhagen Consensus, which got underway by the economists back in 2004, was an attempt by leading economists to say, if we had, in those days, they've increased the number, $50 billion to invest in countries around the world to improve the lives of people, where would we invest it? And they repeatedly identified undernutrition in general and micronutrients in particular. Number one, best investment in 2008, micronutrient supplements for children, vitamin A and zinc. And some of the people involved had more hair on their chin, were also thinner. That's Keith West, Joanne Katz, Jim Tilch, and I even had hair in those days when we were getting going. Thank you very much.
I think we're going to save questions for the end. Al, thank you very much. That was compelling, and tells the story that many micronutrients probably have to go through in one phase or another, shorter or longer. There are some folks here in the audience that have played really important roles, represent agencies that have played important roles in this kind of work. I see Nita Dalmaya from UNICEF in New York with this, Howdy Buis, and Fabiana Mora from Harvest Plus, Ellen Piwas from Gates, and so many others who have been playing an important role in this kind of a story that needs to be learned from and maybe shortened in the future. So we go from vitamin A to vitamin D. We go from a vitamin that has been through the trenches and through the wars, the 100-year wars, to get to where we are, to another vitamin that McCollum discovered, and yet has so far to go. And so we have, consistent with that, we have a young investigator, Dr. Will Checkley, who is, Dr. Ames, a physician and epidemiologist, and well-trained in nutrition, biostatistics, pulmonology. What else? Have I missed anything? You got it. I got most of it. I got about 50% of it. Dr. Checkley is going to speak on vitamin D, and I understand the best century is yet to come. Hope we all are around to observe it.
Thank you very much, Dr. West. Well, thank you for that introduction, and I'm honored to speak at the George Graham Lecture, especially because I grew up in Peru, and I learned how to become a physician-scientist in Peru while a student here at Hopkins. So Dr. West has charged me to whet your appetite about vitamin D and chronic disease, and that's what I hope to do, and also to just talk about some of the current controversies also in the definition and in the health effects of vitamin D. But you can't talk about vitamins without, again, mentioning E.B. McCollum. And as Dr. West mentioned, the story of vitamin D starts with rickets. Back in the 1600s, when there was a transition, it was increased urbanization, moving from rural to urban, rickets became a bigger problem. And there was a lot of there was a lot of research thinking about this anti-rachitic substance and how to be able to stop it. So this is where again E.V. McCollum's discovery of vitamin A, brought this idea that there could be substances that help diseases, and Sir Malamby started by devising this diet that was free of a trace component that led to rickets. That later on was because he mentioned vitamin A in this, got E.V. McCollum's lab interested, and through a series of elegant experiments, he went ahead and his group went ahead and degraded vitamin A from oils, and then found that it initiated the healing of rickets. So that's one side of the story of vitamin D, because later it was also discovered that sunlight played a very important role, and that irradiation, whether it was sunlight or UV exposure, led to the formation of vitamin D, and that later on it was kind of in the skin as well, and the importance of sunlight to be able to activate vitamin D, and that's what led Adolf Windhaus to get the Nobel Prize in relating this steroid hormone and its conversion to vitamin D. And but is vitamin D just about bones and calcium, and does it lead to just kind of liver and kidney activation? I think we've learned so much more about vitamin D in the last 30 to 40 years, and it's just more than bone and calcium. So you think about, if you look at the literature and you see what tissues express vitamin D receptor, you can see it's all throughout the body. And as a matter of fact, there's more than 2,000 genes that are up or down regulated by vitamin D. And so there's a recent GWAS study that looked at just what happens to genes in general when in the setting of improved vitamin D levels, and they basically showed that the improved serum vitamin D was associated with a 1.5-fold alteration in the expression of at least 300 genes. So it's playing an important role. And as a pulmonologist, I do need to talk about the lungs, and you can see that vitamin D is activated in multiple tissues, including the lungs. So then this study here by Hans Dotter et al. Shows that primary respiratory epithelial cells play a role in converting just the 25-hydroxyvitamin D to the active form of 125. And they did so by showing, just kind of taking two different cells. One was a cancer cell line, and another was a primary respiratory epithelial cell, showing this conversion. And then they were able to actually show the quantitation compared against no cells, and showing that indeed that and that respiratory epithelial cells have the presence of this activating 1-alpha hydroxylase. So how is vitamin D defined? And this I think is being a topic of controversy, and there's no clear consensus. You have expert panels disagreeing on this, and from the IOM to the Endocrine Society. So deficiency, I think the deficiency part, most people say, well, so less than 20 is probably a bad thing. I think it's being more difficult to what defines insufficient, what defines sufficiency, and there's a big disagreement in this middle region, and whether 30 is enough. But that aside, if you just look at the global burden of vitamin D deficiency, this is a big problem. Just talking about 1 billion people are affected, and if you look at numbers, and especially in high-income countries, anywhere from 40 to 100% of elderly, apparently healthy Americans and Europeans suffer from this deficiency, and it's also highly prevalent in children and adolescents, and especially in countries where you expect to have a lot of sunlight. We had an opportunity to look at a population-based study, and this was in Peru, and we took two sites in Peru. One was in Lima, and the other in Tumbes. There was about 1,400 kids, and about 200 of them had vitamin D measured. And one of the things that we found and what we discovered was that despite the fact that we're talking about a very narrow range, Lima and Tumbes in distance, there was a significant deficiency of vitamin D in the Lima kids, about 50%, compared to the Tumbes kids. And these are box percentile plots, basically. What it shows is just an adaptation of a box plot in which here's the 50 percentile, 25 percentile, 10 percentile, 5 percentile, so on, and the opposite side. So one could see if you take the 20 nanograms per milliliter cutoff, there's a significant deficiency of vitamin A and vitamin D in Lima versus Tumbes. And a lot has to do, again, just going back to the 1600s as to how Ricketts started with urbanization and what problems that urbanization bring, whether it's just spending more time indoors, the increase in obesity, and we know that fat cells sequester vitamin D. But also, we know that there are race differences in vitamin D levels. So it's well known that blacks have lower vitamin D levels than do whites, and part of the reason is skin pigmentation. There's less sun penetration. But in a study that was recently done here in Baltimore, about 2,000 adults that decided to look at this a little bit more carefully and think about what these data are saying. So indeed, in these adults, vitamin D levels were lower. Vitamin D binding protein was lower, but bone mineral density was higher in blacks versus whites. And more importantly, when they went ahead and they came up they did a measure of what the bioavailable vitamin D, they were exactly the same between blacks and whites. And just if you look, they went ahead and also stratified it by quintiles of parathyroid hormone. And they just saw that there was basically no difference in bioavailable vitamin D between blacks and whites. So this brings the question is what are we measuring? What is important? Another important finding of the study is that they showed there was an important difference in the polymorphisms of vitamin D binding protein, and that blacks showed 80% of one type and whites showed 80% of the other. So could it be that are we measuring the right biomarker to say that this is a deficiency? So thinking about health effects in vitamin D, and we're going to focus on chronic disease. So we've learned a lot about vitamin D, and more information just has come to light. And you can see it affects multiple organ systems. It goes anywhere from just generalized angiogenesis and apoptosis to prevent clonal proliferations and in specific groups like breast, colon, and prostate. In the kidney, it helps to regulate renin, decreases renin expression, which also helps with blood pressure. In the pancreas, it helps to augment insulin and augment its sensitivity as well. In the immune system, it has many roles in the immune system, all the way from microbial activity to cytokine regulation, to immunoglobulin synthesis, to hematopoiesis. And in the vascular cells, it appears to decelerate atherosclerosis. And in the lung, there's also data showing decreased asthma risk and severity, decreased pulmonary infections through the immune system, and it corrects the steroid resistance in asthma and COPD. And but when you think about this, and I think I put this schematic here to remind us about the kind of the early origins of disease, that much may actually start very early, and that they may be fetal programming. So there's some good data to show that vitamin D does upregulate many genes early in utero, and it is also true in the lung. So the human fetal lung is very affected by vitamin D regulation, and we had an opportunity in Nepal to look at nutritional consequences in lung development, and in this study in which we looked at 1,300 women who were receiving vitamin A versus placebo, and we were able to show that this plays a big role in lung development. But Dr. West made me remember that vitamin A and its especially vitamin A receptor is coupled to vitamin D, and that a lot of the effects that vitamin A are probably having are linked to how vitamin D is working. This schematic I took from a website that is a website in vitamin D, and it's a semi-quantitative interpretation of what's available. But basically what I wanted to illustrate here is that indeed it appears, and based on the evidence, that as you increase your levels of vitamin D, many chronic diseases are affected. And when you look at the literature and try to summarize the information, it's being mostly based on observational studies. I think there's a good amount of randomized trials, and a lot of these randomized trials come from kind of in cardiology. I think there's been a good amount of evidence, a little bit more evidence in cardiology in other areas. But at least in overall mortality, when they've actually looked at what vitamin D does, it appears to have a 6 to 8% decrease in mortality with vitamin D supplementation. And this is equivalent to about a 10 to 20 nanogram per ml increase in vitamin D. And in this one meta-analysis, which included about 65,000 individuals, it basically shows that there appears to be a plateau. Kind of seems to kind of level off somewhere here in the higher ranges, anywhere beyond 50 to it kind of levels off somewhere a little bit over 50, kind of 30 nanograms per ml. Then when you think about other chronic diseases, there's been a good amount of meta-analyses, and these are meta-analyses that have anywhere from like 8 to 50 studies. And most of them observational, several of them randomized, especially in the cardiovascular. They all kind of show the trends that there's a twofold increase in depression risk comparing lowest to highest levels of vitamin D. There's about a little bit under a half decrease in cardiometabolic disorders in the highest versus lower levels of vitamin D. There's a decreased risk of future diabetes as well, and about 40% reduction in the highest versus lowest levels. And chronic kidney disease mortality is also reduced, and colon cancer is also reduced. They say like about a 10 nanogram per ml increase in vitamin D is associated with a reduction of about 26% in colon cancer in large population studies. How about vitamin D and asthma? So there's much of the evidence for vitamin D and asthma is related at the moment in observational studies. And while there are several trials that are ongoing to answer many of the questions, when you think about vitamin D and asthma, vitamin D insufficiency and asthma have many common factors. One is obesity. There's migration to industrialized countries. There's also a component of race where there's more asthma in one group and more vitamin D insufficiency in group in another. And also just living in the inner city itself has a big role. And just going back to some of the ideas that we talked about, this in utero programming, there's been some cohort studies that have looked at data of how vitamin D, especially maternal vitamin D, before and during pregnancy, how it affects asthma in offspring. There being at least 4 studies, reasonably sized, that have looked at this, and the mothers who took maternal vitamin D supplements versus those who didn't had a decreased odds of having a child that wheezed later in life, and this was about by half. And also, other allergic diseases are affected, such as maternal vitamin, such as eczema. So it's being shown that cord blood vitamin D status is observed in infants who develop eczema, and that the eczema risk was increased. It was about almost tripled when cord blood levels were under 20 versus 30 or above. Other outcomes, you're thinking about asthma outcomes per log unit increase in vitamin D, multiple outcomes, whether it's use of anti-inflammatory medications, inhaled steroids, in the methacholine test, or hospitalizations, are all reduced with increased vitamin D. And this is from our site in Peru, in which we had a chance, again, the same Lima Tumbes study, that we've, in this cross-sectional population-based study, we saw kind of a clear relationship between vitamin D levels and asthma prevalence, especially when you stratify it by site as well. And when we had a chance to do an analysis and a multivariate approach, again, you see that there's a high prevalence of vitamin D deficiency in Lima versus Tumbes. But what was interesting is that we found that the odds of asthma was pretty much in that group of children who had atopic disease or allergic disease that requires some immunomodulation, which probably is the role of vitamin D. So here we're speculating that probably it's that group of children that have atopy that benefit the most from higher vitamin D levels in how this affects the risk of asthma. And kind of the last point I wanted to make is that of vitamin D and steroid resistance. So there's kind of good data already showing that vitamin D deficiency may increase steroid resistance. That is very important in obstructive lung diseases like asthma and COPD. So there's some basic science data showing that putting cell cultures of CD4 cells with dexamethasone and with vitamin D enhances IL-10 synthesis. That, it's a potent anti-inflammatory. And then in a study, the CAMP study that looked at severe asthma, it basically showed that vitamin D deficiency was associated with a slower increment in FEV1, which is just lung size or lung function. And in these kids, there was a much lower growth or poorer growth of lung function in these group of kids, which is also being seen in adults with COPD and according to the levels of vitamin D. But when they went ahead and they just analyzed and more just categorically, they saw that this group that was on inhaled corticosteroids and were vitamin D sufficient had better outcomes than the rest of the groups. You can see that the vitamin D insufficient levels, even though they're on inhaled corticosteroids, they had higher risks of having severe exacerbations. And then vitamin D plays a big role in the lung. So we know that it's probably having some immune effects that leads to reversal of steroid resistance. It has an improved handling of respiratory infections, where it's showing you that the vitamin D is activated in the lungs, and that it probably has an important immunomodulatory role in the lungs. And it probably also has a big role in allergic disease, so reducing allergic disease. And also, it appears to have through their kind of the vitamin D receptor and the retinoic acid receptor complexes, it appears to also decrease airway smooth muscle proliferation, all benefiting multiple aspects of the disease and asthma. And then finally, just to, should we be supplementing kids based on the evidence that we have, or adults, for many of these diseases? And the expert panels have not been convinced, and they haven't been convinced about the information yet. They basically say that there's insufficient evidence other than for musculoskeletal health, mainly because many of these studies are observational. We have some few good randomized trials, but I think more evidence is needed, especially in multiple diseases. And just kind of the safe upper limits right now are kind of 3,000 international units a day for children under 9, and then 4,000 for those above 9. And what are the future directions for vitamin D, and what should we be thinking about, kind of the next steps? So there's insufficient evidence to recommend supplementation at a larger level, but it's potentially a powerful intervention given its simplicity of administration. And we need more randomized clinical trials in this area to examine both the effects of vitamin D and prevention and treatment, and understand the mechanisms that this do. So thank you very much. And,
We're running a little bit late for our coffee, but we can take one question while the coffee starts to get poured. Who wants to be that person? Ingrid?
Thanks for giving me a second chance to ask a question. Great talk, well, thank you. Questions about your own study. How do you tease apart the cause and effect to naysayers who say, oh, well, kids with asthma, especially in rural areas, don't play outside because they have asthma? How do you know the asthma isn't the cause of the low vitamin D rather than the other way around? And keeping with that, you've reported the elevation, the latitude, but not the altitude, the elevation of those two sites. And I know Michael Hollick found out that seaports and urban areas tend to have fog and pollution that blocks it, and that may be more important than the latitude. So how do you account for elevation, and also elevation's contribution to asthma and pulmonary disease in general?
Two great questions. So thank you. So the first needs better evidence from longitudinal studies. You're right. We did studies that were cross-sectional in nature. It's a good segue because we have an ongoing longitudinal study in which we're following about 1,400 kids with and without asthma, in which we've characterized vitamin D at baseline and having an opportunity to look at longitudinal symptoms over time. So hopefully this can give some of the temporality relationship. It's still association-based. But I think the next step is to think about randomized trials and to think about supplementation of vitamin D in children with and without asthma to see if this has an effect. And luckily we have at least 4 large trials that are ongoing in asthmatic children to see if that has an effect. And hopefully in the next year or 2, we should hear the results from many of these trials. So the question of urbanization, I think, is a critical one. You're correct that air pollution plays a very big role. So the data that we had in our study didn't show the data, but we had an opportunity. We teamed up with colleagues at Environmental Health Sciences, especially Pat Bricey, and had an opportunity to do several measurements of air pollution, ambient air pollution in both the sites, and found that Lima had like at least 3 to 4 times higher rates of air pollution, and probably is. And you know Lima is a horrible foggy place and smoggy place, and probably does contribute a lot. And this idea of urbanization, going back to how the problem of rickets started, is the transition from rural environments to urban environments, living indoors and not as much exposure to the sun. As for altitude, I haven't had a chance to kind of explore the relationship of altitude and vitamin D yet, but I can say that just a little bit of time outside and high altitude, that gives you a good sunburn. So, well, and I know we have a tea and coffee break, so don't forget to add milk. Okay.